Welcome to Religion in the American Experience, a podcast that explores how religion has shaped America and how America has shaped religion, which can help us as we wrestle with complex questions of American governance and purpose in the 21st century. Here's your host, Chris Stevenson.
Hi, everyone. We're back for another episode in Season 4 of Religion in the American Experience. Here we are celebrating America's 250th anniversary, the semi-quincentennial, and uncovering whatever of its religious roots we can find and investigating them. Not too long ago, someone told me that Article 16 of the Virginia Declaration of Rights deserved its own episode during the 250th, so here we are. The overall plan from the museum's perspective is that by understanding this thread a little more at the end of the episode than we did at the beginning, each of us will be better equipped to be stewards of religion's role in the American experiment in self-government. We've pressed the one and only Daniel Dreisbach, the guy who actually tipped me off to this, into service. Daniel Dreisbach is professor of justice, law, and criminology at the School of Public Affairs at American University. His principal research interests include American constitutional law and history, First Amendment law, church-state relations, and criminal procedure. Thanks, Daniel.
Well, thanks for having me. I'm looking forward to this conversation.
So let's just get right into it. First, tell us what the Virginia Declaration of Rights is and why it is so important from your perspective that Americans understand and celebrate it during the semi-quincentennial.
Well, coming up on June the 12th of this year, this 250th anniversary year, the Virginia Convention unanimously adopted the Virginia Declaration of Rights. And so this is right in the spirit of America 250 that we give a little attention to this document that comes out of Virginia. I would suggest to you that the Virginia Declaration of Rights is one of the most imitated and most influential of American founding documents. I would even describe it as a pillar of American founding principles and an exemplar, if you will, of the American constitutional tradition. I think it might be helpful for me to put this document in a little bit of a context. The Virginia Fifth Convention, which was the Patriotic Revolutionary Convention, it convened in Williamsburg on May the 6th of 1776. On May 15th, the Virginia Convention essentially declared independence from Great Britain. They sent instructions to their delegates at the Second Continental Congress meeting up in Philadelphia to press for independence. And believing perhaps that Virginia had reverted to a state of nature, leading Virginians, including those in the convention, thought it was necessary to create a new social compact or a new social contract. And they would start by declaring what their rights were, what their natural rights were. And so the convention appointed a committee with the task of writing a Declaration of Rights as well as a plan of government, what we might call a constitution. And so this is a document that grew out of this moment of crisis where there's a question: what is the government in Virginia, having declared independence from Great Britain? Now, the principal authorship of the Virginia Declaration fell to George Mason. And sometime in late May of 1776, he wrote a preliminary draft to which the delegates added a few additional articles. And it was debated there in Williamsburg in late May and early June. In early June, interestingly, a copy of a draft of the Virginia Declaration was published by a local newspaper, and it began to circulate up and down the Atlantic seaboard. And so copies of this preliminary draft show up in many of the newly independent states who are going to be engaged in writing their own declarations of rights. And perhaps even more important than that, a copy ends up in Philadelphia in the hands of Thomas Jefferson, and he's going to borrow from language in the Virginia Declaration of Rights in crafting the Declaration of Independence. I would describe this document as a brilliant, brilliant distillation of, of the principles of republicanism as Americans at the time understood that. By that, they meant government by consent of the governed, as exercised through representatives of the people. It affirmed ideas like limited government, separation of powers, due process of law, things like that. These are ideas that have a very ancient tradition going back to the ancient English Constitution as well as common law. And so it's just a fascinating, brilliant distillation of the ideas that Americans held dear at this moment of independence. And so I think it's for that reason that we remember and I indeed should celebrate this document.
Okay. Well, that's really helpful. Were there other similar um, groups writing similar documents in other states that also
Well,
were circulated and had influence, or is this the principal one?
Well, there were attempts going back many generations to craft something like a Declaration of Rights in the colonies. The Massachusetts Body of Liberties in 1641 is one such effort, but this is really the first of these post-independence, Revolutionary era Declaration of Rights. And as I said, copies of this document show up in other former colonies, now newly independent republics. And at least six, maybe seven of the other states are going to craft their own state Declaration of Rights, clearly with a copy of the Virginia Declaration of Rights in front of them. Because you can see the DNA of this Virginia Declaration of Rights showing up over and over again in the Declaration of Rights that are going to be written over the course of the next few months, and in fact over the course of the next few years, as the former colonies begin to reestablish themselves as independent states. I should also note that some 10 years or more later, when the states are debating ratification of the Constitution written in Philadelphia in the summer of 1787, a number of states drew on the Virginia Declaration of Rights in recommending amendments that they thought should be made to the United States Constitution. And of course, the first Congress that met under the Constitution drew on these proposed amendments in crafting what would become the National Bill of Rights. And so there are provisions in the National Bill of Rights, for example, the Eighth Amendment, that is lifted word for word, comma for comma, from the Virginia Declaration of Rights. It also has an influence beyond America's shores. The French declarations of the rights of men and citizens in 1789 clearly bears the influence of the Virginia Declaration of Rights. And so the influence of what happens in Williamsburg in crafting this most important declaration extends far beyond the borders of the Commonwealth of Virginia.
Okay. Well, we can say go Virginia then.
That's right.
All right. Well, let's delve into the Article 16 itself of the Virginia Declaration of Rights. Do you have can you read it to us? It's not that long. Do you have it there with you?
I do. Let me read it.
Why don't
I'm
you
gonna
read it
have
and then answer this question? How significant is this article in the entire array of political thought that went into establishing independence and founding American constitutional democracy? We want to know what this particular article did. So go ahead and read that.
So Article 16 is the last of the articles in the Virginia Declaration of Rights, and the initial draft was written by George Mason, but there was input from other delegates, including a very young, untested delegate by the name of James Madison, and he's going to offer some very significant amendments to the draft that Mason had proposed. But this is the language of Article 16. that religion or the duty which we owe to our Creator and the manner of discharging it can be directed by reason and conviction, not by force or violence, and therefore all men are equally entitled to the free exercise of religion, according to the dictates of conscience, and that it is the mutual duty of all to practice Christian forbearance, love, and charity towards each other. There it is, Article 16.
Okay. Go ahead. Yeah, I do have
Yeah,
further questions about some of the details that you point out in the article you gave me, but broadly speaking, tell us about the influence of this.
well, many of the provisions in the Virginia Declaration of Rights, I would describe as brilliant distillations of ideas that had been around for a very long time. Article 16, by contrast, I think is a very original, innovative part of the document. It takes us into some new territory. It forces us to think in a new way about the meaning of religious liberty and the scope and application of religious liberty. It also, I think, gives us some insight into the importance that the founding generation attached to religion and religious liberty. I think you could argue that they viewed religion as vitally important to their experiment in self-government, insofar as they looked to religion to nurture the kinds of civic virtues that they believed a self-governing people must possess. So I think this is an article that really opens up a window into the world of the framers, the founders, at this most extraordinary moment in their history.
Yeah, no, I absolutely agree. Let's talk about some of these details. So, can you, Daniel, explain the significance of the debate between George Mason's use of toleration, that word, and then James Madison's amending free exercise suggestion?
Yes, this gets us to the heart of the profound innovation of Article 16. Um, in fact, I would be willing to argue that this particular point that you've drawn our attention to is really the most important contribution that Americans have made to political thought and practice. So let's back up. Mason, in his original draft, this is George Mason, had used the language of toleration. He had framed the article using the most liberal and enlightened language of his age when he spoke that religion should be tolerated very broadly. But this did not go far enough for the young James Madison. And historians tell us that in his first public interjection into political debate, Madison, as this very young delegate at the Virginia Convention, proposes alternative language. He essentially says, look, this is a revolution not about mere toleration, but rather it's about affirming our natural rights as citizen. And the danger he sees is that the language of toleration presumes a human authority, let's say the civil state, perhaps acting in concert with an established religion, that in its benevolence grants you the right to practice your religion. But if it's in that posture of granting you the right, it can also revoke that right. And that's the danger that James Madison sees in Mason's language of toleration. And so Madison offers as an alternative that we adopt essentially the language of liberty, the right of religion as a natural, inalienable, indefeasible, irrevocable right that's placed beyond the reach of the civil state. And I think this is a profound expansion of how we view the rights of religion. And essentially, I believe this is the view that's going to be enshrined in the First Amendment to our Constitution. So this is a great, great insight that Madison offers and a great expansion of our understanding of religious liberty.
So, before this time, or at this time, because this was just James Madison suggesting this, people really thought of religion in context of the state not as something natural within them that they had a right to exercise and believe. Is that
I think
Active?
that's right. This takes us back to Constantine and sort of the linking between church and state, more than a millennium earlier. And so if you look at Western history over the next, 1300 years, um, religion and the state were to varying degrees tied together.
Yeah.
Virtually every European power of this time had an established church. And again, some of these established churches in European powers, as was the case in some of the English colonies that had established church, some of them were somewhat liberal in tolerating dissenting or non-conforming sects. But there are always limits to what the
Yeah.
dissenters could do. They were always subject to the power of the civil state and the established church. So, in that sense, they were merely being tolerated. Now, let me just say here as an aside, I think of toleration as a personal virtue, as a good thing, right? We're speaking here of toleration as a matter of state policy, where the state allows you, under certain circumstances, to practice your religion. But if it has that power to grant you that, it can also take it away. And again, that's the very danger that Madison saw in the use of this language of toleration. And again, some state churches were more liberal, more tolerant than others, but there was always this lurking danger behind the concept of a state policy of toleration, that it could simply remove that toleration whenever it was convenient for the power of the
Yeah.
state.
Where did this come from? Was this simply an academic, logical exercise in Madison's mind, or do we know the origins of this for him?
Well, it's partly tied up, I think, in sort of the natural rights theories of the day, right? Increasingly, rights across the board, not just religious rights, but civil rights as well, were being redefined, rethought of by Americans as natural rights. Again, in the same sense as those that are given to us by God, and if God gives us these rights, the state can't take them away from us. Now, of course, there may be limits on the practice of our religion or the practice of our speech or almost any other right. But the natural rights idea suggests that there's something inalienable. Of course, this is a word that's going to show up with great significance in the Declaration of Independence. But
Okay.
I think it's partly rooted in natural rights theory. It's also rooted in a growing sense of the value of disestablishment. This is when we begin to see a breaking away from that very ancient model that we had long associated with Constantine. Um, and someone very interestingly, who we should celebrate in this year of America 250, it shows up, by the way, in the work of a Scotsman by the name of Adam Smith. He makes an argument that if you want to have a vibrant, effective, influential religion and culture, the way to do it is not to give a state the monopoly over religion, but to place religion in an open marketplace of ideas where various religious sects can compete with one another. And it will soon become evident to the people the most efficacious, the truest, the purest of faiths will emerge in that marketplace of ideas. I mention Adam Smith, of course, because he writes about this in The Wealth of Nations, which was published in 1776. So another of those connections
Yeah.
to America 250.
Okay. So James Madison was processing all these things that he read about at that time, and then made that took what he was reading and hearing about natural rights and extended it to religion and said, okay, let's not tolerate, let's give free exercise. Okay.
Yes, I think that's right. But I think he's making the argument in a clearer way than we'd heard before.
Yes.
So
Yeah.
we've got to give him much
Absolutely.
credit to,
Yeah.
to this to this thought and the introduction of this thought into our actual frame of government.
Yeah, no, absolutely. Yep. Okay. Let's look at now the phrase in Article 16, duty we owe to our Creator as the definition of religion. Why is that significant, Daniel?
Well, in conversations and debates about the meaning, the scope, and application of religious liberty. A critical issue often in these debates is, what do we mean by religion? It's a notoriously difficult term to define. I have no doubt that it's been a part of conversations at the museum. How do we define religion, right? Now, the significance here is that Mason offers us a definition, right? He says religion, or the duties which we owe to our Creator. Now, you and I may not, at the end of the day, say that's the best definition, but he's beginning this conversation about religious liberty with a definition, and it's going to be an influential definition of religion at the time. James Madison, who some years later writes his famous Memorial and Remonstrance essay, petition, I should say, quotes directly from Article 16 of the Virginia Declaration of Rights and its definition of religion. So this is going to be an early entree into this debate over how to redefine religion. I think it's fair to say that the Supreme Court in the 20th century has adopted a much more expansive understanding of religion that is entitled to the protections of religious liberty. But I think it's noteworthy that Mason thinks it's important to offer at least this most minimalist of definitions of religion. And he defines it, by the way, in terms of relationship to a creator, to a God, as I would take that to mean. In other words, I think the suggestion is that simply because you believe something very dearly and sincerely does not make it the equivalent of a religious belief under the protections of religious liberty. There's something distinctive about the beliefs that we would call religious beliefs, as opposed to any other deeply held belief system.
Okay, that's important distinction to make. Any importance to the use of creator instead of God?
Well, I probably would not put much significance. Of course, the word creator is going to show up in the second sentence of the Declaration of Independence. And maybe this is worth mentioning here. The very first article of the Virginia Declaration of Rights uses this language, and I'm going to quote from it if you're okay with that.
Yeah.
Mason had written, and the Virginia Convention had adopted this phrase, and see if it sounds familiar to you. All men are by nature equally free and independent, and have certain inherent rights, namely the enjoyment of life and liberty, with the means of acquiring and possessing property, and pursuing and obtaining happiness and safety. Historians tell us that that draft of the Virginia Declaration of Rights, from which I have just read, showed up in Philadelphia in late June, and Jefferson drew on that language in crafting that most important second sentence of the Declaration of Independence, where he speaks of this idea that we are endowed by our Creator. Again, there's that word again, with certain inalienable rights, that among these are life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. Now, he's refined and revised that language from the Virginia Declaration of Rights, but the historians suggest that Jefferson's working off a draft of Article 1 of the Virginia Declaration of Rights. Just another one of those connecting links between the Virginia Declaration and what we'll be commemorating this July 4th.
Yep. Okay. All right. Now, the phrase in Article 16, moving on, quote, "and the manner of discharging our religious duties," close quote. So that phrase, what's the importance of that part of the article? I think there's a big one here.
Yeah. Well, again, and let me just say, I think what's fascinating about Article 16 and the debates surrounding the language that eventually found a way into Article 16 is they're anticipating some of the most contentious debates over the meaning of religious liberty, the most contentious debates that would continue to the present day in the 21st century. We've already talked about how we have these ongoing debates about what do we mean by religion. This is another one of those debates that this language points to, and the suggestion here is that religion and religious liberty is not something that protects beliefs and beliefs only. Rather, the protections of religious liberty extend to the actions, the conduct that follow from your beliefs and are deemed necessary to fulfill one's obligations to the Creator. There's been a vein of thought in American constitutional discourse that says, look, the First Amendment protects your beliefs, but it's very qualified in what it protects when it comes to your conduct. I think this challenges that notion and says, no, religious liberty protects both beliefs and the actions that follow from those beliefs. And I think that's a very important point to be made.
Yeah. Okay. All right. Let's look at the two last phrases, and then we'll jump to the last question I ask all guests. So there's the phrase so by reason and conviction and not force or violence. So that's important. And then second, uh, unrestrained by the magistrate. So Daniel, talk to us briefly about the importance, the salience, the significance of those two phrases in Article 16.
Yeah, I think the first of those really gets to the heart of what's important about religious liberty, right? Matters of religious belief arise from that voluntary, interior conversation between a man, his conscience, and his God. Genuine belief cannot be the product of external coercion. Religious belief, if it's genuine, cannot be achieved by the end of a bayonet or a sword. Right? And again, this I think takes us back to this idea that the very notion of religious liberty is about creating an open marketplace of ideas where we can debate, we can reason, and we can choose to believe based on what persuades us, not because we've been coerced to believe something, not because the state tells us we must believe it, but rather it is the product of a voluntary choice. And again, I think, when we look back at human history, there's a very sad story of religion being imposed by coercion, by the sword, if you will. And this is an utter rejection of that history. And again, suggesting the importance of voluntary belief. The issue of the magistrate arises. Now, interestingly, this is an amendment that's being proposed that does not actually end up in the final draft, but in the debates, I think what it's suggesting is that matters of religious belief are outside the jurisdiction of the civil magistrate. Right? It's a matter between you and your God. It is not the role of the state to dictate one's religious beliefs and practices. And Madison picked up on this. He quotes this language, and he carries it to, I think, what is his an important conclusion, which is this: is that our duties to God are precedent, both in time and priority of obligation, to our duties to the civil state. And that's why the civil state has to take a second seat, so to speak. It does not have priority over our obligations to God. And so there's an ordering of our obligations as human beings, first to God, and then we can talk about our duties and obligations to the civil state. But again, matters of religious belief are not within the jurisdiction of the civil magistrate. And I think that's being underscored by this language.
Okay. Excellent. So here in conclusion, Daniel, do you want to share any further lessons or takeaways from this topic, Article 16 in the Virginia Declaration of Rights, either in terms of important historical transformations you have noticed or in terms of helping us better understand our present moment in the American narrative?
Yeah. Well, the penultimate article in the Virginia Declaration, Article 15, makes this point. It says, if we want to preserve our free government, if we want to preserve the blessings of liberty, we must make frequent recurrence to fundamental principles. That's a quote lifted there from the Virginia Declaration. And I think it's good to remind ourselves of that. I think this is a good time in history. This is a good time in the life of our nation to think back, to reflect on the fundamental principles upon which our political community has been based. And one of those fundamental principles is a belief in not the free exercise of religion as a privilege, as something to be merely tolerated, but rather religious liberty, the free exercise of religion, as a natural, inalienable right. I think we constantly live when we must be vigilant that the state is not merely tolerating religious exercise, but is respecting it as a natural and inalienable right. This is not something that's achieved and the issue is done. It's a constant struggle to ensure that religion and the right to practice our religion is viewed as a genuine natural right, not something that is merely tolerated. And I think this is a good year, a good time to reflect on that principle.
Hey, Daniel, you have the last word, and it's a good one. It sounds like the museum needs to be in Williamsburg on June 12 of this year. June 12, right?
I hope so.
Yeah, I'll have to think about that. We have been talking with Daniel Dreisbach, professor of justice, law, and criminology at the School of Public Affairs at American University. Daniel, thanks so much. Well, I'm going to say that the explanations and elaborations you have offered have equipped us to be better stewards of religion's role in perpetuating the American experiment in self-government, and I appreciate it.
Well, thank you so much for giving me this opportunity.
Religion in the American Experience is produced by the private Digital First National Museum of American Religion. Scholarly support is provided by Dr. Lauren Turek and audio and video assistance by Dr. Randall Stevens. The music was composed by Evan Chamberlain.